you have any stories about how Grandma and Poppy met, or is there any you heard?
Well, Mary Jean has a bunch of stories.
Yeah, but did you hear anything or remember anything from what Poppy or anybody told?
I was too young, you know.
Okay.
The only thing that I've heard is what Mary Jean told about their canoe trips, etc.
He came from Augustana, graduated already, but he was taking credits for his master's degree at the Iowa State Teachers College, which was a very well-known graduate school. And he came with his friend, and they met the girls. Granite's mother was running a girls' dormitory, and she lived right on campus, big house, and I think they had maybe 10 or 12 girls living there. Nancy and Mother, the boys that would go with them down the river canoeing, and the only story I have is that Nancy said to Hallie, I want the tall one and you take the other one. Of course, that isn't the way it worked out. The other one was Paul Youngberg, or whatever his name was. The tall one was Herb. And so they dating all summer. And then they both went back to teaching.
I remember my father saying that he was teaching in Wisconsin, in a little town in Wisconsin, and he had her picture, and the landlady said to him, boy, she's a pretty girl. It's that picture we have of her hair all pretty. And he said, she says, well, why don't you go after her? And he said, well, he wasn't sure. And then she came. She left her hometown and came to see him. I think it was at Christmas time, or sometime, and stayed a weekend or two, and then after that they got married.
She were both very interested in my father, and she said she was going to get him because he had a good body. And you know, she's a farm girl. They look at teeth. She looked at Shirley's teeth before we married, and she got him. But I think she was a lot better looking than Nancy at the time. Nancy was never a beauty.
But there was like 3 years in between, or 2 years between the time they met and the time they married.
She would talk about my father going canoeing with them, I think, both of them, up in Wisconsin or wherever they were teaching.
Yeah. Well, when was that now?
1920.
20. So you were
in college.
And
going out to teach. She was 5 years older than I.
Right, and she'd been teaching. Right?
She had been teaching, but she was home for the summer, and it was that summer that me and my group of girls, I and my group, were going to have a house party, and we were told by our parents we had to have a chaperone. Upset about that because we didn't know whom to ask, but we finally decided that Hallie was older than maybe she would be willing. We weren't sure she would be willing because it made her seem kind of extra old, but she was delighted. Your grandfather and his friend, 2 Swedish boys, they lived in the house, they had taken rooms in the house next door to where we lived, because both of them wanted to get more schooling so that they could get better jobs in teaching. Since my mother always spoke to everyone who came by, said, well, I haven't seen you fellows here before, how do you like it? And they said they liked it pretty well, except that they didn't know anyone. And then she said, Marie, come on out here, and I met them. I was the first one to meet them.
Before Grandma.
And I didn't know their names. And then Mother said, these girls are having a house party up the river. And the thing was then, of course, I would ask them to come. And since men were very few and far between at college, I knew that the whole group would be glad to have 2 men come. So I told them about the house party, and they looked pleased and said they would come. This party was for a group of students with whom I had graduated.
Oh, I see. Yes, you would,
We had taken a house up the river,
Mm-hmm.
which is about 6 or 7 miles up the Cedar River, where there were a lot of little houses where people stayed for the summer or something.
Yeah,
And we were having a house party for 2 weeks, and Hallie had agreed to be the chaperone. He had seen them briefly, and since Paul was the older of the two, he had sort of been the one that
she was sort of looking at him.
Looking at a little bit, as you might say. And Herb, because I played his accompaniments, they both were very nice to me. They knew us because we were the hostesses that were asking them up. The other girls didn't even know them. It was the last Sunday that we were to be there. I was kind of amused because our chaperone, your grandma, had gotten her hair all fixed up special. And I knew she was looking forward to the fact that there were two gentlemen coming too. So we saw fairly early in the afternoon, we heard someone singing, and we looked out up down the river, and there they were in a canoe singing, and both paddling, one at the front of the canoe and the other at the back. And we knew that's who it was. The house where we were having our house party was on a bank that was about 9, 10, maybe 12 feet right straight up from the river, and there was a little narrow path where you could stop a boat, but there's almost no place at all to put a boat or a canoe even. And you got out and went up that path and you were there, and that was it. So the problem was, where would they put the canoe? They couldn't leave it in the river. So they must get it up the path. Well, it wasn't heavy enough, so they couldn't at least lift it and bring it up. So as was quite often the case, your grandmother had very strong ideas as to how that should be done. So she went out and began to help them and tell them what to do. And I must say, they needed telling, and they were willing to be told. And the thing was to get it up, they couldn't, the path was too narrow to bring the canoe up. But since it was lightweight, if they could point it so that it could be lifted up on top of the bank. Well, in order to help them better, your grandma went down through the little narrow path and on the little tiny edge. And she was down at the back of the canoe because she always was willing to help and put her hands and her strength in. Herb was down where she was, and she was helping lift it. And Paul, his friend
the other
was
Swedish
pulling up at the top, and in order to make it go a little better, he pushed it back a little to get it started up better. And he didn't know that Hallie was there, and he pushed her right into about 8 feet of water. And she had been dressed and combed and just beautiful. And she just came up dripping. And when your grandma was angry, she could really lay anyone out with her tongue. And she came up that path dripping, her hair hanging down and dripping. And she told Paul Youngberg what she thought of him. But that started out a whole business. You see, from that point on, Mr. Youngberg would have nothing whatever to do with Hallie. And you could, if you'd heard it, you wouldn't blame him. And I think Herb was more amused, although he kept a straight face, than anything else. He was entirely, I think Paul Youngberg influenced him very much. I think wherever he was an influencer. And he was really very attentive, and I thought maybe it was because he had been so berated by your grandma. I didn't know about that, but anyway, he was pleasant to talk to, better than pleasant. And but if we ever were together, I was playing Herb's accompaniments, and he sang, and he loved to sing, and so that 9/3 of my time they were both there, and I was playing Herb's accompaniments because we had a piano in the parlor, and the one at Hallie's house wasn't in good tune. Then I didn't know whether I didn't think much about it. The summer was over, I was going to school, Hallie was going to wherever she was going to teach. And I went to Decorah, And in about 3 days, Mr. Youngberg came to Decorah. And I found, to my amazement, that he was very much more interested in a future relationship, shall we say, than I was, and that I hadn't even thought about. And the style was then, you hung your fraternity pin on someone you wanted to have remember you forever. And I could not accept the fraternity pin, and he left in very much discouraged. But I was amazed that he came to Decorah before I'd even started to teach.
Well, what happened to Herb and Hallie?
Both the men had jobs teaching. I don't remember where, but they were both like principal or superintendent.
Yeah.
And they had come to Cedar Falls to school to get better jobs. Herbert began writing to me.
To you?
To me. I had a couple of letters from Paul, but not...
After that, not many.
He was pretty dashed by the fact that I wouldn't wear his fraternity pin. And didn't think much about it because I was busy starting to be a teacher and meeting other men around town. And that was also different because there had never been any men at TC.
Sure.
And it was quite a thing. And I remember, I thought Herbert wrote such good letters. They were so newsy and every conceivable thing. And sometimes he'd tell a little bit about where Paul was and what he was doing. And so we, not often, but we could say we kept in touch. I think it was about, possibly about the time I was to go to Fort Dodge to teach. I think it may have been about, not at most 5 years, maybe only 3, that she came home that summer, and she said she had decided she was going to get another degree, and she was going to the University of Wisconsin to get it. And everybody asked her, I think it's kind of a foolish question, but this was the way people thought then, why do you have all these wonderful jobs? Why do you need another degree? Well, she was going to go to a degree, and she told me, I think privately, I remember I was quite impressed and also somewhat shocked. She said, it's time I got married. She said, you decide and you get married. And I said, so that's why you're going to Madison. Well, she said, I'm going to get married. And I said, well, do you know who the lucky man is? And she said, no, she didn't know. But she went to Wisconsin, and it wasn't very long before I found out, and I think she had known it all along, that Herb was going to go to Wisconsin too. And by February 14th, I had the announcement that they were married.